Hello students, and welcome to the final video of Module 3. Congratulations on making it this far. In this video, we're going to pick up right where we left off and doing some practice problems with the derivatives of inverse functions. Let's get started. All right, so here I am right here. So we've got this big table, right? We've got f, we got g, we got f prime, g prime, okay? And so we want to find these values, find the value of the derivative, right? The derivative of the inverse of f of 3. Okay, so as I'm doing this, I'm going to use the formula that you learned in the last video. And so we're going to get 1 over the derivative of f of the inverse of f of 3. Okay, and remember what inverse means. Okay, inverse means you just swap the x and the y value. So I'm really just going down this column with f and I'm looking for a 3. Okay, so when I find that 3, that's going to be, so remember the x and the y swap, so that's why I'm swapping it over. So I'm looking at the f column to see where that x of 3 is, and then my new y value for the inverse is going to be 1. So I'm going to get 1 over f prime of 1. Okay, so now I can look over here to see what is f prime. So 1 over f prime of 1. Now I got to find that x value. There's 1 right there. F prime at 1 is going to be 2. So 1 over 2. And that is going to be that value. That answer is going to be 1/2. Okay. And so now I want to take it over here and I want to do a very similar thing, okay? So this time we're doing it with g. Okay, I'll do this one in red. So I've got the 1 over g prime of g, the inverse of g of -2. Okay, there we go. And so we're going to get 1 over g prime and the inverse of g of -2. So I'm looking at g. I found a -2 right there. And so I'm looking again at that 1, so g prime of 1. All right, so here's the 1, I'm looking at the 1, now I'm coming over here to g prime, and that's equal to 1. So I get 1 over 1, which is equal to 1. So that derivative comes out to be exactly 1 here. All right, and again, this is why I love the chain rule. This is why I like looking at tables, because if you know these, it's just like a scavenger hunt, right? And you're just like, okay, bouncing from here, bouncing to there, bouncing to over there. And it's just like kind of all over the place, but like that's what my brain loves. I love doing that search. I love when things work out right. So we're going to move on here. We've got more table, another table, right? And you can do this from graphs as well. But what we're going to do is we're going to start to use these again with tangent lines and such. And so let's keep that in mind here. Find the value of the derivative of the inverse of g of 1, and then find the equation of the tangent line, okay? So as I find this here, we're going to be looking at this, and so I want to find the slope of the tangent line first, okay? So the slope of the tangent line to the graph of the inverse of g when x equals 1. Okay, so the slope of the tangent line. 1 over g prime of the inverse of g of 1. All right, and so that is going to get me the inverse of g of 1. Again, I'm looking at g. I'm finding a 1 right there, and so that's going to be equal to 3. So 1 over g prime of 3. And so that's what I want to do. So I follow this 3 again, and I go to g, and that's going to get me -2. So 1 over -2, or -1/2. Okay. So now as I do the point of tangency, sometimes I do it in a different order. That's totally fine. So as I find the point of tangency, we want the inverse of g of 1. Okay. So we know the inverse of g of 1, okay, we found that to be equal to 3. Fantastic, right? And the reason I'm just kind of saying that is because we did it right over there. All right, so the inverse of g of 3 the inverse of g of 1 is equal to 3. So as I'm going through this, I just need to write down my equation of the tangent line, which is going to be y minus 3 equals -1/2 times x minus 1. That's it. That right there is the equation of the tangent line. So again, it's an application of what you just learned with the derivative of inverse functions, all right? So let's keep going here. And we're going to look at some of these things. So estimate the value of g prime of 1. Again, you want to think, is this asking anything about the inverse? I know that's what our lesson's on, but you just need to read the question. You got to figure out, what is it really asking me? Is it asking me anything about the inverse? No, not in this case. So estimate the value of g prime of -1. All right, so let's do that first. G prime of -1. So g prime, right? And -1 is happening somewhere in between there. So I can find this value by going y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. Okay, so y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. I'm using all those values here. All right, so as I write that down, g prime of -1 is approximately -3 minus 2 over 0 minus -2, so plus 2. All right, so I get -3 minus 2, so -5 over 2. So -5 halves, okay? So based on this value, what conclusion can be reached about the graph of g when x equals -1? All right, so when x equals -1, again, it's talking about the original function g. What is that behavior? So we know that the derivative comes out to be negative, all right? So what conclusion can be reached is, when the derivative is negative, what is the graph of g doing? What is the original function doing? It's decreasing there. So g of x is decreasing at x equal to 1 because g prime of -1 is going to be a value less than 0. It's going to be negative, okay? And so think about those when you're writing down your answers. Again, don't get caught up in like, all right, derivatives of inverse functions, doing that over and over again. Read your questions and figure out what they're answering and what tools you're going to need to apply here, okay? And so now we've got one more question. This is going to be the first time you've ever seen this, but prime. Don't say prime. It's the second derivative, okay? So you can do lots of derivatives, so g double prime, g to the third derivative, okay? After that, usually we just put in numbers, not exponents again, but just values to denote that is the fourth derivative, the fifth derivative, okay? So we want to find the value of the second derivative of -1, okay? We're going to do pretty much what we just did a second ago, but this time when we do it, we're going to be doing it with the derivative. So if I want to estimate the second derivative, I'm using the derivative values to estimate those, okay? So -1, again, is happening in between 0 and -2, and so I'm using 2 and 3 in this case, along with that 0 and -2 from before, okay? So the second derivative of -1 is going to be approximately 2 minus 3 over 0 plus 2 again, all right? And so I get -1/2, all right? And so based on this value, what conclusion can be reached about the graph of g prime, okay? So notice here, I'm just going down one level. I'm going from the second derivative to the first derivative. So when I just go down one level, think about what we are doing a second ago up above. I was going down one level. I was going from the first derivative to the original. Think about it just like levels. Original, first derivative, second derivative, third derivative, and you can go down as well, okay? So what was happening there? So we know that g prime of x is, again, since it's negative, so it's decreasing at x equals -1. And we know this because the second derivative at 1, so the second derivative g of -1 is less than 0, is negative again. So we made a conclusion about the first derivative based off of analysis of the second derivative, okay? Again, no questions about the inverse function. So you really want to understand what tools you need to bring in here, okay? And as we go into our next unit, our next module, you're going to want to keep in mind that these connections between the first and the second derivative and the original function, we're going to be utilizing those as we do a lot more analysis into graphs And a lot of what you see here is going to come into play later on in calculus as well, as we start to apply these things in some more real world scenarios. You've seen very few real world scenarios, and so now we're going to take all these tools and apply them. Okay, so if you don't have these tools down, you really need to review these videos, do these practice problems, go through these notes again, doing these problems again, repetition, repetition, repetition. That's going to be what gets you those skills in calculus, okay? That's going to be what gets you this 5 on that AP calculus exam in May. Of course, if you do need any help, reach out to me. I'm always here to help. I'm Mr. Hernandez, and this was Mr. Hernandez Teaches.